Geography is destiny. This phrase, geography is destiny, occurs and reoccurs in the popular culture. Its persistence, in fact, lends to it a kind of folk legitimacy that makes us wonder, is there not something to it? Books, studies, popular discourse continue to give credence to the notion that geographical forces condition human behavior in predictable ways, and that we should understand this power, so better to manipulate it to our ends. David Landis's powerful 1998 book, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, is constructed on the premise that geographic location is the key factor in explaining economic results worldwide, why some nations are poor and others rich. And we have an entire body of systematized thinking on the effects of geography on human politics and conflict. It is, in fact, a branch of social science that seeks to explain world events in just such determinate terms. This minor discipline has become one of the buzzwords that has grown in popularity since the 1990s, and it often leavens the heady wine and cheese conversations that people conduct over international politics. That discipline is geopolitics. Geopolitics has been around for as long as recorded history. Even Aristotle engaged in a bit of geographic and ecological determinism when he formulated his conception of the ideal state. The geopolitical premise is that the unchanging characteristics of the physical world in which we live condition human behavior and our interactions. While other influences may be transitory, the permanence of geographic influences can form the basis for explaining the actions of nations and for predicting the future. Geography has a decisive impact on the interests and actions of nations and people. In fact, geopolitics, it elevates geography to primacy in explaining international political activity. Remember Sir Halford Mackinder's famous geopolitical dictum about Eastern Europe being the key to the heartland, and thereby the world island, and thereby the rule of the entire world? Well, with vague metaphorical concepts like heartland and world island, it's perhaps not surprising that geopolitics has had critics. The field is also derided as geographic determinism, just as Karl Marx's economic theories are criticized as economic determinism. Determinism. Determinism seeks single-factor explanations of complex phenomena, and geopolitics had an unfortunate run of association with the Nazi aspirations of Adolf Hitler, and this tainted the word for more than 4 decades after the close of World War II. Now, today, by contrast, most folks using geopolitics probably have no idea of its lineage, its theories, or even what it means. Now, the core idea of geopolitics is this: geography is an important source of political, military, and economic power, and the different aspects of geography afford different degrees of power. Geopolitical notions have leavened our way of thinking for years, and some geopolitical truisms have seeped into our discourse. For instance, traditional Swiss neutrality is explained as a result of the surrounding Alps, a mountainous barrier allowing this small country a political choice unavailable to many other nations. And similarly, American democracy is sometimes explained as a result of the 2 vast ocean barriers that shielded a young and growing nation from the depredations of more entrenched European models. The open plains of Eastern Europe explain the many invasions suffered by the Russians from Western Europe throughout history. After all, it's a fact that the eastern banks of the north-south rivers throughout Eastern Europe are an average of 6 feet lower than the western banks. For traditional armies, this makes invasion from west to east much easier than in the other direction. Geopolitics has even given us laws or maxims that purport to instruct us on the fundamental geographic effects imposed on humans by geography. After all, with so much theory and thought that is intangible and abstract, it's reassuring that here is a discipline that seems rooted in specific features of reality, that is rooted, quite literally, in the soil, and whose impact does not change. This was the view of Nicholas Spikeman, a prominent second-generation geopolitical theorist who died in 1943. Spikeman said this: "Geography is the most fundamental factor in the foreign policy of states because it's the most permanent. Ministers come and ministers go, and even dictators eventually die. But mountain ranges, they stand unperturbed." This is breathtaking stuff, and it plays out on a tapestry of enormous scale, both in time and in space. But geography matters not only in the grand sweep of politics, it also impacts us in phenomena closer to home. Let's consider the microgeography of situations that arise in our professional lives, both as individuals and for our firms or our teams. Here we talk of how we interact with the ground, the air, our surroundings in competitive situations, how we interact with the ground we stand on while we interact simultaneously with our opponents. The minor geographical features that may seem inconsequential in isolation can take on tremendous importance as events unfold. They can sometimes take on history-changing importance. What geographical features? Take the simple matter of, say, a sunken road. A road that cuts down between the banks of earth on each side. It's on just such a nondescript feature that world history hinged on June 18th, 1815. It was the sunken road of Ohain. The road was unseen and awaited its moment in history. A hollow path no more than 12 feet deep in some places and as wide. It stretched across a battlefield for more than 4 miles. The battlefield? A place called Waterloo. Now, the maneuvering of great armies against each other is usually described as the product of generalship, or of numerical superiority, or of technological supremacy, or of innovation. But geography can sometimes play a decisive role in the outcome of great conflicts. The 1815 Battle of Waterloo is one such conflict that offers up a historical pivot point for our consideration. Now, one of the most stirring accounts of the Battle of Waterloo appears in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. The battle pitted French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte's 74,000 troops against the British Duke of Wellington and an assortment of Germans and Dutch, Belgians, and Prussians, approximately 70,000 in all. In June of 1815, the two armies had joined the engagement, and the battle had been raging several hours. Napoleon, he observed the movements of his army from the crest of a ridge. He could see into the valley below and up to the next ridge where began the plateau of Mont Saint-Jean. Napoleon stared and he calculated. The question before him was, should he send in his cuirassiers against the British, his heavy cavalry? Almost 4,000 cavalrymen riding gigantic horses, a terrifying sight of cavalry led by General Millard. The great General Napoleon surveyed the ground, his keen eye missing nothing. In the classic work of literature, Les Miserables, the writer Victor Hugo described it this way. Before giving the order for this charge of Millard's cuirassiers, Napoleon had scrutinized the ground, but had not been able to see that hollow road, which did not even form a wrinkle on the surface of the plateau. The emperor, he swept his glass for the last time over all the points of the field of battle. He pondered. He examined the slopes. He noted the declivities. He scrutinized the clumps of trees. He seemed to be counting each bush. He gazed at the English barricades of the two highways. He observed the old chapel of St. Nicholas. And then he bent down and spoke in a low voice to the guide Lacoste. Put on the alert by the little white chapel, Napoleon had probably put a question as to the possibility of an obstacle to the guide. The guide Lacoste made a negative sign with his head. The guide had answered no. We might almost affirm that Napoleon's catastrophe originated in that sign of a peasant's head. And then Napoleon acted. He ordered his cuirassiers forward. That's the armored cavalry, named for the cuirass or breastplate they wear. He ordered his cuirassiers to break the infantry squares of the British and to carry the tableland of Mont Saint-Jean. The sunken road of Ohain awaited them, a road that disappeared into a cut not visible from the French commander's position. And it was on this sunken road that world history turned for a few hours on June 18, 1815. The cuirassiers galloped down the hill and up the opposite ridge in two long columns, left and right. But on the right, disaster struck. Again, Hugo describes it. The head of the column of cuirassiers reared up with a frightful clamor. On arriving at the culminating point of the crest, ungovernable, utterly given over to fury in their course of extermination of the squares and cannons before them, the cuirassiers had just caught sight of the trench, a trench between them and the English. It was the hollow road of Ohain. It was a terrible, terrible moment. The ravine was there, unexpected, yawning directly under the horses' feet. The second file pushed the first into it, and then the third pushed on the second. The horses reared and fell backward, landed on their haunches and slid down, all 4 feet in the air, crushing and overwhelming the riders. The inexorable ravine could only yield when filled with horses and riders, rolled there pell-mell, grinding each other, forming but one mass of flesh in this gulf. And when this trench was full of living men, the rest marched over them and passed on. Almost a third of Dubois' brigade fell into that abyss. This began the loss of the battle. There is no doubt that had they not been enfeebled in their first shock by the disaster of the hollow road, the cuirassiers would have overwhelmed the center and decided the victory. Now, geography is not important in and of itself. A mountain has no inherent value. A river, a plain, a sunken road. Geography takes on importance only as human beings and machines utilize it to a purpose, and its value is usually temporary. In competition, this interaction takes on the character of a three-way dialectic. Opponents maneuver against each other as they interact with the battlefield. Locations on the battlefield take their significance for the moment with respect to the actual deployment of the forces engaged. This is the process of maneuver or of positioning. The geography of every battlefield has inherent positional power, whether that battlefield is the field at Waterloo, the office conference room, a football field, or the ordinary chessboard. This inherent positional power arises from the principles of competition that dictate the terms of engagement on the battlefield. It doesn't take much acumen to recognize that the positional power inherent in a battlefield would vary tremendously based on a different rule structure, and strategy would change accordingly as well. Let's look at sports for an example. Take American football. We know that each team can score a touchdown by moving the ball along the field to one end zone or the other at either end of the football field for a score of 6 points. This geographic fact conditions the strategy of the game. But what if we change this? What if we paint a large red circle in the middle of the field and we award points for moving the ball into this large red circle? Now, we quickly can see how the positional power of the game's geography would be changed dramatically. The end zone value goes way down, and the center of the field assumes incredible importance. Now, from the previous example, we can see arising two notions of power as it springs from geography. There is potential positional power, and there is realized positional power. The potential power springs from the investment in the battlefield of the technology and the tactics available to both sides. Realized power springs from the actual deployment of forces, their condition, their numerical strength, and the skill and timing of maneuver. Let's take another example, this one from the game of chess. Now, as an instrument of instruction, the game of chess is a powerful, powerful tool in many respects. It teaches us deployment of resources, coordination of attack and defense, the necessity of planning, the criticality of constant evaluation, and the virtue of foresight. And chess also teaches us much about the critical factor of geography. The chessboard without its pieces, is a deceptively simple affair. It consists of a board with 64 squares in 8x8 arrangement, alternately colored light and dark. Given the rules of chess and the resources we know will be deployed, the board offers us verities about the inherent positional power of certain areas of the board's geography. Given those rules and resources, technology and tactics, we can see that certain squares have more potential value than others. Let's examine the board with that in mind. From the standpoint of pure potential power, the center 4 squares are the most important on the board. And chess is essentially a struggle for control of those 4 squares as necessary to victory. The 8 surrounding squares rank next in importance. And so the strategy of a winning game is based on seizing early control of these 4 central squares as essential to eventual victory. But during the course of the game, the value of the board squares changes with every change in the position of the pieces. Let's consider what happens when we add the pieces. The three-way interplay of 2 combatants and their relationship to the field of battle, it's a complex dynamic. Pieces, of course, have a certain power inherent to their ability to move. The more versatile the movement of a piece, the more powerful. But a piece's power can be enhanced or limited by its location on the board. The pieces on the board in combat derive their power from the configuration of their various locations. Conversely, the locations on the board fulfill their power potential from the overall configuration of the combatants. A type of synergy is in effect, and this is what is meant by interactivity. Now let's move from the chess board to the office conference room. Consider the seating arrangement at a conference table. The seating arrangement takes on significance from the purported rank of those seated at the table. Assorted power configurations can arise, configurations of power based on the seating of those attending. The shape of the table, types of chairs, all impact the configuration of power. For example, in a negotiation, the microgeography and the position within a venue can confer advantage. The terms of the negotiation can be changed to physically alter the position. Let's take an extreme example of the office conference room and the potential power that configuration and environment can confer, if manipulated in the appropriate ways. Panmunjom is a small Korean village situated in the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. It was the site of the armistice that ended the Korean War in 1953, and it still serves as the site of negotiations between the South and the North. The geography and spatial relationships in the negotiating room take on hyper-significance in this highly focused, highly charged touch point. Gamesmanship and high-stakes maneuvering within the cramped confines of the negotiating room is the norm in Panmunjom. Said one journalist, in one of the conference rooms, the North Koreans once sawed a few inches off the chair legs so that their counterparts at the table would look small and look silly. And on another occasion, the North Koreans violated the agreed-upon protocol when they attended a round of negotiations with AK-47 assault rifles hidden under their jackets. It was an obvious intimidation tactic, but the Allies struck back with their own ploy. They turned up the heat, literally. The Koreans sweated in their heavy clothes, but were unwilling to take off their coats to reveal their weapons. At Panmunjom, positioning and machismo are part of the show. The soldiers assigned to Panmunjom are chosen for their intimidating appearance. The South Koreans must meet a height requirement almost 2 inches taller than the national average, and they must have a black belt in martial arts. Americans assigned to Panmunjom are selected for their physical bearing and for their height. In the venue of the negotiating room, this emphasis on space and height is little more than a micro version of seizing the high ground before a confrontation. We face our own version of it in the ubiquitous office meeting. Now let's change our venue to sports and see how this concept of geographical positioning plays out. A good example of the use of space in battle is the sport of boxing. If you're not philosophically opposed, watch a boxing match. Observe the combatants maneuvering against each other in space and in time. Note the repertoire of punch, feint, counterpunch, jab, and cross. Note the combinations of punches. Note that the boxers do not stand in one place, slugging it out against each other. They maneuver around the ring and the space available to them. Now, the ring itself is featureless and finite, but each square foot takes on significance with relationship to the boxers and vis-a-vis their position in the ring itself. But is this true in other sports as well? Actually, it is. Let's have a look at American football. In football, too, the field of play yields positional power based on principles. Commentators constantly talk about good field position and how well a team does in the red zone, those last 20 yards before the goal line. Well, as for how to get to those last 20 yards, it's generally best to maintain the ball here in the center of the field, equidistant from each sideline. And this provides a balance of options for both right and left and puts the defense into a position of more uncertainty. So, we can see that geographical positioning can play a major role in either enhancing or decreasing our power in a conflict situation. The military has developed a systematic and sophisticated method for learning about and understanding the ground on which to fight. This tool is called Intelligence Preparation of the Battlefield, or IPB, and it's a lesson or a process that's easily adaptable to our own challenges in arenas other than that of the military. In military scenarios, we know that the high ground confers advantages in principle. Conversely, we know that taking the hill is a daunting proposition. Rivers and valleys and mountain ranges offer barriers to an enemy and to our own advance. The IPB process systematically assesses the information relevant to friend and foe on a particular battlefield. An intelligence officer collects and evaluates this information and then communicates it in the form of intelligence to the commander. The relevant U.S. military manual describes intelligence preparation of the battlefield in the following way. IPB is a systematic, continuous process of analyzing the threat and the environment in a specific geographic area. It supports staff estimates and military decision-making. The IPB process helps the commander selectively apply and maximize his combat power at critical points in time and space on the battlefield by determining the threat's likely courses of action and by describing the environment your unit is operating within and the effects of the environment on your unit. The intelligence officer employs the IPB process continuously, very much like the intelligence cycle we review in another lecture. Continuous feedback in the IPB process, in theory, can enhance the commander's decision-making. Intelligence preparation of the battlefield consists of 4 steps. First, we define the battlefield environment. This means we identify characteristics of the battlefield that can influence both friendly and competitor operations. We establish the limits of the battlefield, and we identify what we don't know but must know. Second, we describe the battlefield's effects on our operations, on what we intend to do, and this step always includes an examination of terrain and weather, but may also include discussions of the characteristics of geography and infrastructure and their effects on friendly and threat operations, as well as other factors such as politics, civilian press, local population, and demographics. And the third step, we evaluate our competitor. If it's a known competitor, we determine how the threat normally organizes for combat and conducts operations under similar circumstances. We can rely on historical databases and well-developed threat models, but if we face a new or less well-known competitor, we may have to develop our intelligence databases and threat courses of action simultaneously. In the fourth and final step, we determine our competitor's possible courses of action. The main question that we must answer is this: given what our competitor normally prefers to do and the effects of the specific environment in which he's operating now, what are his likely objectives and the courses of action available to him? Now, the intelligence officer performs the IPB process continuously to ensure that intelligence for the commander is always current and useful. And you can see that this IPB process is quite a useful tool. It's the systematic evaluation of the battlefield's environment and an assessment of how it can help you or hinder you. Likewise, what it means to your opponent and how it shapes his likely courses of action. And you can see how IPB is easily adapted for use in the business world as well as your personal decision-making. After all, IPB is done informally by everyone already. The IPB process simply formalizes it, and it deepens it so as to gain even more insight. For us as individuals, the broad lesson here is the importance of geography in our own competitive situations. What potential sources of power are locked in the geography of the likely battlefield? How does geography potentially enhance or degrade strategy? Can you modify your strategy to take advantage of geography or to prevent it degrading your strategy? One of the greatest examples of conducting IPB and then acting on it occurred during World War II. The major lesson of the example is how to respond if you know when and where you'll be attacked. Now, there are several responses to a scenario like this, but the one chosen in this example was brilliant. Call it defense in depth. This was the technique used by the Russians at the 1943 Battle of Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history. To call it defense in depth is an understatement. At Kursk, the Germans mounted what would turn out to be their last major offensive on the Eastern Front of World War II. It was here that the Russians held territory that bulged into the German front over an area 120 miles wide and 90 miles deep and centered on the town of Kursk. In an attempt to cut off the Russian position and trap hundreds of thousands of prisoners, the Germans attacked from north and south in a pincer movement. But the Russians knew of the attack well beforehand through their intelligence network. Over several months, they prepared successive defense lines, making use of the geography of the area to channel the German attack in directions to make them vulnerable. In fact, the Russians altered the terrain significantly and made the battlefield a living hell for the Germans, a tanker's nightmare. The Russians planned to slow, to exhaust, and to wear down the Germans by forcing them to attack through a web of minefields, planned artillery fire zones, and concealed anti-tank strongpoints comprising 8 progressively spaced defensive lines, 150 miles deep. To get an idea of how formidable the defenses were, this defensive belt of 8 successive lines was more than 10 times as deep as the French Maginot Line. The German attack commenced and it began to stall almost immediately. The Russian defense was like a meat grinder that chewed up the entire German strategic tank reserve in a week, culminating in the Battle of Prokhorovka, the largest armored battle in history. The Germans never broke through, and the strategic initiative passed from the Germans to the Russians for the very last time. So, the defense in depth is one response to an attack you know is coming. Build your defense in depth so that you withdraw to carefully prepared successive lines. In such a case, encourage your opponent to wear himself out on your metaphorical fortifications. Choose the battlefield carefully and modify it to suit your defense. Prepare a gauntlet for your competitor to pass through. It's apparent that the effects of geography play into the outcome of battles both great and small, battles that can affect the course of world history, and battles that may be important to no one but us. The effects of geography may not be as decisive or as determinate as geopoliticians would have us to believe, but its effects may be enough to tip the scales our way if we plan judiciously. Regardless of the stakes, if the battle is worth fighting, then it's worth conducting your own intelligence preparation of the battlefield to give yourself the greatest chance for victory. Geography, your position on the field of battle, should not be left to chance. Evaluate your position. Select it beforehand if possible. Note the inherent strengths of the various options open to you. Evaluate the conditions of the conflict to come, and then manipulate those conditions to your benefit. This is the lesson that geopolitics bequeaths to us. So, examine your terrain systematically, and don't forget to look for sunken roads.